All right, welcome everyone. Welcome to our first 2023 Wild Ones River City program. My name is Linda Gary, and I am the president of the River City chapter for this year. Before I get started, if you want to put your location in the chat box, that would be great. It's always fun to see where everybody is coming from. We have a lot of people that have registered for the program tonight, and they're from all over Michigan, as well as some out-of-state folks. So we are looking forward to another great year of learning about native plants, their importance in our ecosystem, and ways to incorporate them into our gardens. Thanks to all of you who made it to our events last year. We celebrated 15 years as an organization and are looking forward to building on that for many years to come. For those of you who might be new to our organization, I want to read our mission statement. Our mission is to promote environmentally sound landscaping practices to preserve biodiversity through the preservation, restoration, and establishment of native plant communities. Our motto is healing the earth, 1 yard at a time. Well, we have lots of ways for you to get involved this year as we put our mission into action. I'm going to mention a few events, but you can always look on our website for details. We have some great programs coming up, like this one tonight, where you can increase your knowledge on so many interesting topics. If you like to volunteer doing different things, we have lots of volunteer opportunities. One of the ways that you can volunteer is to help with our information tables that we have at various outreach events in our area. You can hand out information about wild ones and share your enthusiasm and knowledge about native plants with other folks. If you want to get your hands dirty, come to the work days at our native plant education garden. You can weed and thin and even take a few native plants home with you. Last year, volunteers stepped up to put 721 volunteer hours in. That's an amazing amount, I think. These volunteer opportunities are a great way to meet other people and to help out and to have a good time. We also will have our native plant sale at the Fulton Street Farmers Market, as well as our annual native plant sale in July. Local growers from the Native Plant Guild will be offering lots of great plants at these events that you can buy to take home to your garden. Last year, 792 native plants and over 200 seed packets were bought or shared at our events. That's a lot of great seeds that are going out into the gardens in our area. Information on all of our 2023 events, as well as recordings of past programs, can be found on our website and on our Facebook page. Also, please note, if you haven't already done it, that you can sign up for our March program on our website. Marty McCleary, our Education Committee Chairperson, will be presenting on Aldo Leopold and finding a land ethic for our time. Aldo Leopold was a pioneer of the modern conservation movement. His book, Sand County Almanac, was published in 1949, but his words and philosophy are still very timely today. Marty will talk about his life and his philosophy and how we can apply his ideas to our lives today. This will also be a Zoom presentation. So I hope we will see you in March. Please sign up. Before we introduce our speaker, there are a couple of housekeeping items that I want to remind you about. Most of you have gotten really good at these Zoom webinars after the last couple of years, but just in case, I want to call your attention to the two buttons at the bottom of your screen. The chat button is where you can type in comments during the presentation. That is also where we will post websites and other links that correlate with this program. I believe there will be a link to the website of our presenter, Barb Barton, and you can buy her book through that website if you want to. The Q&A button is for you to type in questions that you might have for Barb to answer at the end of her presentation. And lastly, you will receive an email in a couple of days with a link to a YouTube recording of this program. You're welcome to pass it on to anyone who you think would enjoy it. That's all I've got for now. Barbara Z, our program committee co-chair, will now introduce our speaker. Barbara?
Thanks, Linda. We're very excited tonight to have Barb Barton with us. Barb is the author of the books The Amazing Adventures of a Midwestern Girl and Manoomin, the story of wild rice in Michigan. She's a almost lifelong Michigander and an endangered species biologist by training. She finds inspiration in the region's rich history. Manoomin traces the interwoven stories of the Anishinaabek, European colonizers, and the role native wild rice has had in shaping their shared histories. For Barb, storytelling and the cultural preservation are one and the same. In addition to her nonfiction books, she's authored articles about the complex relationships between people and food for Michigan History Magazine and the Historical Society of Michigan's Chronicle magazine. Barb travels the state as a public speaker and sometimes folk musician. Interesting. Continuing the oral traditions that have informed her research and writing. She is currently working on her third book with the working title, Gifts from the Earth, Wild Foods in Michigan. Barb has an MS in ecology from Eastern Michigan University and a BS in wildlife management from Michigan State University. Manoomin won a 2020 Bronze Medal Independent Publishers Award, 2020 Choice Outstanding Academic Title, a 2019 Michigan Notable Book Award, and a 2018 Michigan History Award in the University Press. So, wow, outstanding. Please welcome Barb Barton. Thanks.
Oh, thank you so much. I am really excited to be here with you today and to share with you the story of Manoomin in Michigan. And before I get started, I do want to acknowledge all of the other people who contributed to this book. I have a lot of tribal friends, and I asked them if they would write introductions to each chapter, because the Anishinaabek story with wild rice is so very, very important, and it's their words that need to tell it, not mine. So I want to acknowledge those folks. And with that, we'll get started on the slideshow. I'd like to acknowledge also the people who introduced me to nature and to wild foods, my great-grandparents, my grandparents, and my mom and dad. And without their inspiration and teachings, I don't know what direction my life might have gone and what my career path was. And I also want to acknowledge this man, Roger Labin from Lac Vieux Desert Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. Roger is a dear friend of mine. He's become like a brother to me. And in 2008, he and I worked together on a wild rice camp up at his tribe. And because of that, I learned about wild rice, and it really changed my life. So I want to acknowledge him as well. Wild rice, or manomen as it's called in the Anishinaabek language, is an aquatic plant. It's a grass, and it likes shallow waters. And we have two species here in Michigan. We have a river rice, which you can see on the left, and lake rice on the right. The river rice is protected in Michigan. It's a state-threatened species. And when you're amongst this amazing plant, a bed of wild rice of this species, I feel like you're in the presence of royalty. It is so beautiful. The plants can grow 10, 12, even 13 feet high, which compared to the lake rice, which gets about 4 feet, maybe 5 on a good day, it's just breathtaking. Wild rice has a very interesting life story. So right now the seeds are down in the sediment, and they're waiting for, well, I guess they didn't have to wait too long this year, waiting for the ice to thaw, waiting for the warm sunshine to heat up the water so that the plants can grow. And when they start off, they go what's called a floating leaf stage, which you can see in the upper right, where the leaves just lay and float on the water like hair. The roots are not well established at that time of year. And so the plant is very vulnerable to disturbance. So you can imagine a motorboat going by there and the wake of the waves, raising and lowering the level of the water, which causes the plants to uproot, which is a death sentence for them. Storms with excessive flooding can also dislodge these plants. So it's very vulnerable at that stage of its life. That happens in the springtime, and you'll see plants in the floating leaf stage through May, sometimes even into early June, but then it'll start to stand up and become an emergent plant like you see down at the bottom. The plant will start to flower, and then by late August, early September, you will have the seeds develop, and the harvesting season and the Wildlife Food Fest, usually around Labor Day weekend. Why is this plant so important to the Anishinaabek people? This story, I'm going to give you a brief synopsis of this migration story. This has been shared with me by several tribal elders. You can read in more detail about it in Eddie Benton Benet's book, the Mishomis book. But a long time ago, the tribal folks that are here today lived in what's now the northeastern part of the United States and southeastern Canada. And they were visited by prophets. And they were given prophecies. The first and the third prophecy spoke about people with white faces coming across the ocean on logs blown by the wind. And that if the Anishinaabek people did not leave the land where they were living, they would be destroyed by these newcomers. So they were directed to travel westward to the place where the food grows on the water. And they began this long migration. And they went down the St. Lawrence River. This took a long time for their migration and for them to land here in the Great Lakes region. But the plant that they found that was the food that grows on water was wild rice. And so they stopped. And that is why we have the Odawa, the Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi here today. Rice camps were a traditional part of the culture of tribal folks here in Michigan and elsewhere in the Great Lakes region. And when I met Roger, we started having some camps up at his tribe to return the teachings back to the people, or I should say not return, it's not really a good word for it, to reawaken, I guess, because of this disturbance in the culture that happened when the colonizers came. Some of the people were removed from their homelands. The rice was destroyed in much of Michigan. That cultural component was disrupted. So these camps were super important and are held in the fall, where people all come together to process rice and do the harvesting. This is a picture from the Nottawasepi Huron Band of Potawatomi in Southwest Michigan, and you can see how big those rice plants are. This is river rice. The way to harvest it is very different than the lake rice because of it being so tall, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But being an endangered species biologist, while I was at this rice camp at Lac Vieux Desert, the first thing I wanted to know is, why have I not heard of wild rice before? I have, an advanced degree. I've been in the field a long time, and I never knew about wild rice. So I started a quest to find out what we had here in Michigan. How many rice beds are there? And are there historical rice beds? And is this a species that we should be protecting? This is a picture of a big rice bed you can see at the, what they call it, at the wide water of the Tequamanon River. It's also known as the Dollarville flooding today. And I've been up there. There's supposedly rice up there. I have not been able to find it from the access points I went to. But during this process, when I decided I wanted to find every rice bed that ever was in Michigan and everyone that is here now, I had to become an historian. And it was not dissimilar to endangered species, where you're out looking for something. that's very rare. Learning how to do this was really kind of exciting and challenging all at the same time. But these are the sources, most of the sources that I used to try to find out this information. I won't go through each one of them. But I started way back in time with archaeological record. And we have 13 sites that are documented in Michigan. And they were found because there were seeds or fragments of seeds in the cache pits at these sites. And they can also find phytoliths, which are little tiny particles of silica that can be identified to a plant species, which is pretty amazing. So we have the archaeological record, in addition, of course, to the traditional knowledge of the tribal folks who lived here. Believe it or not, this is a lot of years of research to come up with these dots. I mean, it looks so simple, these dots on this map, whenever I look at it. But you see on the top, if you look around the coastlines, particularly Lake Michigan, Huron, and Lake Erie, you'll see a lot of dots there. Those were huge rice beds. If you look on the extant map below, there are almost none, right, compared to the top one. Of the 198 historic sites, only 6 of those made the list of extant sites or in existence today. So yes, indeed, we have lost rice here. The largest beds that I was able to uncover historically are listed on this table. And you can see Saginaw Bay was a big one, 10,000 plus acres of rice. And the most that I have seen, and it's at Wildfowl Bay, was 200 acres on a good year. As far as I know, there's no other rice growing on Saginaw Bay. Monroe Marsh had this amazing, huge 4,000 to 5,000 acre marsh that's been completely destroyed. St. Clair Flats was also a great site for wild rice. We've lost a lot of that. Houghton Lake had a big bed, and that is primarily gone. There's still efforts to try to bring it back. So what caused the decline of wild rice here in Michigan? And it was when the European colonizers came to this land, and they had a very different worldview than the tribal people who lived here. And their worldview at the time was to take all of these things they call resources as fast as they can, right? To them, it was like a playground of, oh my gosh, look at all these trees we can harvest, not thinking about the ecological implications. So we're going to start with logging. Logging had an impact on Michigan, unlike anything else that I've seen. The entire state pretty much was completely deforested. And it started off a slow process, much like if you think about farming, when people farmed with horses and plows like the Amish folks do today. That's a much slower process, right? You don't have thousands and thousands of acres of farmland. You can only manage a small amount. And that was true with logging. As they started to develop better equipment like this big wheel, which could take logs out faster, the logging accelerated. They started putting railroads in, which made it even faster to get the logs out. And the deforestation rate increased greatly. If you look at the rivers and the impact to the rivers, they use the rivers to move the logs. And there is nothing that can survive in terms of vegetation and anything that's associated with vegetation can survive this type of destruction that happened. The mills were built along the shores of the river a lot of times, and they would stockpile logs, so you lost all of that habitat as well. Even water quality was affected. This is a floating lumber mill. I think this is taken from the Saginaw River. And they would saw the logs here, but also just dump all of the debris right into the water, which would change the pH. It would increase turbidity. Even today, there's still a lot of problem with that woody debris that was dumped all those years ago. This is a picture of Lac Vieux Desert in the western UP. This is where my friend Roger's from. His ancestors lived here on one of these islands, and they used to harvest wild rice. Like almost every family in the tribe did, and all of these bays that you can see were once filled with wild rice. Down in the lower left-hand corner, you might be able to see a little brown rectangular shape, a light brown rectangular shape. That is the headwaters of the Wisconsin River. The Wisconsin River at that time was heavily used for logging, and they decided to use Lac Vieux Desert as a reservoir to store water for springtime release where they could run the logs faster. And so that leads us into the next impact on rice, and that's dams or changes in hydrology. And in this picture, you can see in the background, there's an older woman and a younger woman with a rifle over her shoulder. They actually lived at a lodge right next to that dam that was built. There's a close-up of them. That dam was built in the late 1870s. Once those water levels were raised, the rice started to disappear because the water was too deep. Wild rice likes shallower water. The lake rice can grow up to 3 feet deep water, but if you get deeper than that, the plant has to use all of its energy to move up and grow up tall. It doesn't have energy left to put out seeds. So what happened when the water levels were raised, the wild rice disappeared, shoreline erosion increased, which made the non-tribal people who had homes around the lake very unhappy. And almost all of the tribal people that lived on that lake left and went to Watersmeet, and that interrupted again a lot of the ricing culture. Now I think there's only 2 or 3 families left that actually rice there. Industrialization and pollution is another biggie. This is a photograph of a little stream that comes off of one of the old paper mills, and they were dumping all of this sludge, and I don't even know what all is in it, but that went right out into Lake Erie. And the Monroe Marsh, which we're going to talk about next in terms of the impacts of pollution. Monroe Marsh is at the mouth of the River Raisin, and it was an internationally known hunting place. Lots of waterfowl here. And also it was known for the American lotus, which was at that time called the Egyptian lotus. People would come here and take out punts, these little flat bottom boats, to pick the flowers. And people came literally from all over the world to go hunting here because of the rice beds. And I want to show you these maps. This was really a depressing part of the book for me to research. You know, I love nature, I love the earth, and to have to go through and document its destruction, it was really hard. It was really hard to do. And looking at these maps, it blew my mind how much we altered the landscape, how we're even capable of doing this. So in 1820, this is what the mouth of the River Raisin used to look like over in Monroe, which, you know, if you don't know, it's in southeastern Michigan, southeastern Michigan. Look at all these islands here at the mouth of the River Raisin. This was where the Potawatomi and the Shawnee used to live. And this was just the most beautiful area. In the 1830s, the Army Corps of Engineers decided that they wanted to build channels in all of the major rivers that outletted into the Great Lakes around Michigan, except for Lake Superior. And so what they would do is they would start digging these straight channels, and that was to facilitate shipping out of the channel. So in 1835, they put the first channel in through that marsh, and it bisected the islands that you see here. The one that's labeled House Island, that is the one where the Potawatomi folks lived. And as time went on, it got channelized even more. This is a hand-drawn map from 1900 that somebody did an amazing job putting in details about what types of vegetation were in the marsh at that time. And you could see that a lot of it, all those red areas, were wild rice. So let's fast forward to 1962. Look how straight the river is now. Look how there are like very few, well, not even hardly any islands left at all. The marsh is pretty much diminished from what it was. And this is the Monroe Marsh, or what was the Monroe Marsh today. The overlay is the original marsh. The orange areas were the wild rice beds. And I should mention with the Great Lakes that wild rice, as I said, it likes the shallower water. And so during high water periods of the Great Lakes, you have smaller rice beds because it's too deep. And when you have a low water period, the rice beds expand. 1900 was a high water period, so the wild rice beds were smaller than they normally would have been. So you can see, even though this was a high water period, you still have a lot of wild rice growing there. But if you want an aerial view of what that marsh looks like today, there it is. And this was a common thing all around the state. So we've talked about logging. We've talked about damming, and now we're going to go into draining. Draining of our wetlands has been a problem here in the state for a very long time, and it actually started back in the mid-1800s. This was all new to me when I uncovered this information. There was an epidemic of malaria in the 19th century, and it was actually believed to be the origin of most of the diseases that people had in those days. And this pink area is the place in Michigan where malaria was most prevalent. The highest rates of malaria occurred 1859 to 1860. And what was interesting back then is people didn't really know what caused it. They knew that it was somehow associated with wetlands, but they didn't know how people got it. And so some people thought it was rotting vegetation that created malaria or released it into the air. Some people thought that it was just a magical thing that just happened. Some people thought it came from decaying dead animals. Some people thought it was related to logging somehow, because once logging happened, it released the epidemic rate. It released a lot of more people getting sick. So they tried to tie it with there. And it wasn't until earlier in the 1900s that they actually figured out what it was. But all they knew is it was related to water and wetlands. So we have to drain the wetlands for public safety, right? For public health reasons. So they started digging these massive ditches, which I'm sure you've all seen as you drive around. You'll now have a different perspective on them, I believe, but you're out in the country and you see those deep ditches on the side of the road, or those straight line ditches that oftentimes were once creeks. That's what they're doing, is draining the water off. This shows you, when I first saw this picture, these red lines are all county drains. And when I first saw this, I thought of like Mother Earth and her veins. Water is life. Water is the life force of the earth. And all of these are cuts into the earth's body to drain this water, to drain off the marshland. And it's quite amazing when you think about how many wetlands we've lost and the impacts of these drains. Of course, having those drains caused the loss of a lot of the wild rice beds as well. In early 1900s, like 1906, I believe, we finally learned that the mosquito was the of malaria. And so they had to figure out another avenue to battle the mosquito. So they started spraying kerosene and oil on the surface of all of these open water areas, which doesn't do anything at all for the wild rice. In fact, is pretty detrimental to it. So Another interesting thing about draining, which was new to me, is I got a call from Frank Edwigijic. And Frank is a tribal elder for the Little Traverse Bay bands of Odawa Indians up in Harbor Springs, Waganoxing. Frank called and he said, "Hey Barb, have you ever heard of a place over by Grant, Michigan called Rice Lake?" And I said, "No, I never have heard of that." He said, we have stories in our tribe of our people used to harvest wild rice there, but it's an onion farm now. What do you know about that?" And I said, "I don't know anything about that, but I will see what I can find out." So if you don't know where Grant is, you can see the little red dot there on the map. Rice Lake, I believe, was the largest rice bed that we had, inland lake rice bed in Michigan. And there's an amazing story about this lake that you should probably read the book to get all the details about it. It's pretty fascinating. But suffice it to say that a local man ended up buying the land where the lake was and a lot of the marshland around it, and tried to create a private hunting club. All the local people said, "Why do we want to pay you to hunt here? We live here. We've hunted our whole lives." So they ended up getting about 7, I think, farmers together, and they had heard about this new way of farming over in Scandinavia called muck farming, where you could drain lakes and marshes and grow root crops very easily. And so they thought it would be a good idea to drain this lake. This lake was about 3 miles long and was surrounded by marshland. And it's also the headwaters, it was the headwaters of the Rogue River. And this is what Rice Lake used to look like in 1880. You can see it's surrounded by state land on the western side, some private ownership on the right, but it was a good-sized lake. And there were actually stories. I went to the Grant Public Library and looked through their files, and I did find the handwritten memoir of a man who was in his 80s, and that was dated, quite some time ago, 1970s, 1980s. But he was writing about Rice Lake when he was a boy, and he described to a T the tribal folks ricing on that lake and how they did it. And it was quite sad to me because I highly doubt that these farmers even thought about the fact that this was a main food source for the tribal people who lived there. But they got their permission from the county drain commissioner, and they went in and dug a ditch 5 miles long and 20 feet wide, and they drained the entire lake, which I can't even imagine how this is possible, but they did. They drained the entire lake and all the marshland around it. Here's a comparison side by side of 1880s. You can see Rice Lake and the associated marshland, and then 1955. It is completely gone. And Grant became, I don't know if they were known as or claimed it, but they were the Michigan onion capital of the world. And in fact, there's a muck farm there today called Rice Lake Farms, and I've had onions from there. You can check your labels, you can find, and those were grown in that lake. So yeah, it's all dark and gloomy historically. There's no doubt about it. But there is a lot of work happening right now, and I credit Roger for his hard work in getting the word out to folks about wild rice. We have had restoration going on historically, which was interesting to me. After the rice beds were pretty much destroyed, the hunters started noticing a decline in the duck population, and they blamed it on the loss of wild rice. So they put a lot of pressure on the Department of Game and Conservation, or what was formerly the Michigan DNR, to plant rice again, to put rice out. So the DNR started sowing rice. This gentleman is using rice seeds in a ball of mud and throwing that out in the water to try to seed things. I found a lot of information about wild rice seeding in the old newspapers. And if you see this map, there was a lot done up in the Upper Peninsula and also in some scattered places in the Lower Peninsula. These were locations that I could find specific information about where rice was put. I saw a lot more references where DNR had given somebody 3 barrels of rice and they were going to put it in lakes around Sheboygan, things like that. Nothing that I could put a dot on a map. So there was a lot of seeding going on. In fact, even the railroad got involved in it. They started throwing rice out the train windows when they would go by wetland areas, trying to help bring the rice back for hunting. Seney National Wildlife Refuge seeded between 1938 and 1968, 33,500 pounds of rice was planted. And unfortunately, it was planted in habitats that I would consider not suitable for rice. And so it never did succeed. There was talk at one time by some farmers about growing wild rice as an agricultural crop to use in cereal, as a cereal. And it was quite interesting in the newspapers that the farmers who did not grow wild rice or did not want to grow wild rice, they were really upset about it. Because if you think about wild rice attracts birds and other, mammals because it's such a wonderful food source. But if you bring in a lot of blackbirds to a rice bed, you're also bringing in a lot of blackbirds to the cornfield. And so they were threatening violence against anyone who would grow wild rice as an agricultural crop. And, that was an interesting thing. And it was I won't say it's a good thing, but we do not want to have agricultural wild rice here. Wild rice that is grown agriculturally has been selectively bred. And those traits that those plants have would be devastating if they got out into the wild population. So we definitely don't want that to happen. And it was a good thing it didn't. The attitude of the DNR with wild rice planting in the early 1900s was that we should plant it everywhere because it's such a great food source for wildlife. But then things changed over time. You can see they had 67 new dedications of game refuges where they gave out wild rice, and they kept really good detailed data on these rice plantings. But the problem was that they only planted 1 year or maybe 2, and you have to keep planting wild rice year after year for a while because it has to build up a seed bank in the sediment. So if they put it out 1 year and it didn't grow the next year for whatever reason or grow as well as it should have, they considered it a failure. And then they started saying, no, wild rice, we don't need it here. We don't need it. Don't waste your time planting it. Well, let's fast forward now to a long time after the 40s. And we have the Michigan Wild Rice Initiative today. That involves all 12 federally recognized tribes, several state and federal agencies. We're working on a manomen stewardship plan through the University of Michigan is heading that up. They got a grant to do this. And it's being proposed as the state native grain of Michigan. It's been in the legislature for 4 years now. And we're hoping that maybe this year will be the year that it gets named. So it's come a long way from having the train railroad folks and the hunters and the DNR in those early days spreading seed around to saying, no, we don't want it, to now we have this big effort to try to bring it back. And I think it's fantastic what's going on. A lot of times when I do these talks, people will ask me about how do I plant rice? I've got a pond, or I want to put rice in the river where I live, etc. And I would say to people who want to get involved in wild rice restoration, it's best to work with an organization that is doing rice work, contacting the local tribe and seeing if there's a way that you can be supportive of it. Planting wild rice is it's a lot different than planting agricultural crop or seeding a prairie. You don't do anything to prepare the site or anything like that, but it has very specific requirements for growth. And it also involves other people. If wild rice takes off, if you plant it in a river and it takes off, it will choke up the river, which is great for the rice. I don't have a problem with that, but it generally doesn't bode well with your neighbors because many people view it as a weed because it can grow very well in certain places. And they don't want to have their lake or their river clogged up with rice. So then the next step is, well, we're going to put a chemical in to treat it and remove it, and we don't want that either. So it's always best to try to work with groups that are already doing wild rice restoration. But there has to be, if you're doing a program like that, you need to have local support. You want to have flow to the water. Even in lakes, there's usually an inflow and an outflow stream. Using local seed sources is best because those plants are well adapted to the growing conditions and environmental conditions of the area. Wild rice, a lot of people think you can just go get some seeds from the grocery store and toss it, but that isn't true. Wild rice has to be planted like within a week or so after it's harvested, generally speaking. If you think about the plant in its natural environment, when those seeds are ripe, they literally drop right down into the water. They don't dry out and get blown by the wind or get eaten by an animal and excreted or anything like that. They need to be in the water pretty quickly. So people will harvest rice and then put it in grain sacks and keep it wet and keep it cool until they can get it into the water. Sometimes people aren't able to plant right away. They'll put those grain sacks in a pond and weight them down so they're underwater, and they'll leave them until springtime and then take them out and plant. But I can tell you firsthand experience, that is a very smelly job. You do not want to do that. You'll smell for a week. You want to have clear water. Water that's got a lot of turbidity in it, where you can't see the bottom, restricts the sunlight that comes down. So that will hinder the growth of germination. You don't want to have much boat traffic. You remember that floating leaf stage, the boats will dislodge the plants or they drive right through it. Carp is another one that makes planting wild rice challenging. Carp love wild rice seeds. And I know you've probably seen them in the springtime when they're rutting around in the sediment. That dislodges plants. It also disturbs the seed bed too. So if we have areas that have a lot of carp, generally speaking, you don't get much success with rice. The same if you have a lot of geese or muskrats or ducks, browsers, a lot of browsers, highly concentrated in an area. If the rice does grow, it'll get up about 6-8 inches high, maybe a little taller. And that's really juicy, nice, tender greens for those birds. And so it's hard to get it to grow in that situation too. You need to have non-acidic soils. Muck soils are super good for rice. Water levels that are pretty stable. And what I mean by you don't want to have flash flooding where you get, really high water levels, super low water levels. That's one of the problems we're having with climate change right now and their impacts on rice. We talked about invasive species. Also, when rice is planted, there are ceremonies that are done and prayers and certain things that are done by the Anishinaabek people to help that plant grow and to honor the water. And so it's a very complex thing, this restoration work. It's not something you can just go toss in the pond. I worked with the DNR. This is from several years ago, and I don't know, there's a lot of different tribes represented in this photo, but we went out and did a water ceremony for the rice and for the water and planted. And we didn't have any success out there. Just about everything that I listed as what could affect rice growing is there. And so we tried seeding there several times and have not had any luck, which is unfortunate. I think that would be a really beautiful rice bed to have there on both sides of 127 north of Lansing. Lastly, what I want to end with on the book is the recipes chapter. I got recipes from many tribal folks around the upper and lower peninsula, so there's geographic variety there. And I want to acknowledge them and thank them for their generous contribution to the book. When I do this talk in person, I always have a blast because generally the crowd of people who are attending my talks, I would say not too many of them watch American Idol. So I'll ask who watches it, and you'll see people sheepishly sort of raising their hand, maybe if nobody else is looking. Well, I was contacted a few years back by the INSP network. They were coming to Michigan to do a television program called State Plate. And I think they were over in the Grand Rapids area too, looking at some food traditions over there. But they wanted to do a segment on wild rice. And the host of the show was Taylor Hicks, who was one of the American Idol winners. The moccasins he's wearing are ones that I made, and so I always try to offer those for sale for thousands of dollars to anybody who's a super fan, but I still have them. I haven't had any takers yet. But you can watch that episode. I think it's on Amazon Prime right now. But it's a really good episode, and it features wild rice and shows you all of the ways that all the steps you take to process the rice. But it also features some other iconic Michigan foods that I found pretty interesting too, including a celery farm that could likely have been a wild rice bed at one time. So that's my, in a nutshell, what is in the contents of this book. There's a lot more detail, a lot more stories about the rice. There's some really nice photographs in the middle, color photographs that show you all the different steps of processing. And so I'm really happy to take any questions, I think, at this time. You can also contact me through my website. You can go to barbbarton.com and order the Manoomin book there if you are interested in it, and I will ship it to you, signed, of course. And with that, I guess we can open it up for questions.
Okay. Thank you, Barbara. That was wonderful presentation. Okay, yeah, we do have a few questions, comments. We have people, by the way, from all over the country. We've got people from California, Minnesota, South Dakota, Ohio, so and of course Michigan. So welcome everybody. Denise wonders, she had met Roger at the Great Lakes Foragers Gathering in summer, and he invited her to the rice camp, and she cannot find or cannot remember the link, and she's wondering if you could share that.
Yeah, I don't have a link for that. It's held up at the Keweenaw Bay Indian Community up in the western UP. And I think if you go to their website, it's always held over Labor Day weekend. So if you go to their website and probably go to their Natural Resources Department page, I'm sure there will be information there. And that camp is open to everyone.
Thank you, Barbara. Okay, so Veronica wonders, how are Phragmites impacting the wild rice habitats, if you know of anything like
Yeah, that's a good question. Phragmites, let me back up a little bit. So I went to Saginaw Bay to look for rice years back, and I noticed the giant wall of Phragmites that basically lined the bay. And at Wildfowl Bay, what I noticed was that the Phragmites grew in shallower water, and then you would have cattails, and then you would have wild rice as the water got deeper. And what was interesting to me is the Phragmites in some ways protected the rice because it intercepted the wave energy coming in from the bay. I don't know what was there before. I don't know if Phragmites displaced wild rice. I just don't know that. I'm sure it probably could. I had read at that time that Phragmites didn't grow in water that was very deep, but since then I've been told by people over at Lake St. Clair, where the rice is, that Phragmites would grow in 3 feet deep of water, which if that, well, I have no reason to doubt that's true, that's not true, but that would definitely displace rice. The other thing that displaces rice, or can displace rice, is if you get a big influx of lily pads, because that blocks the sunlight from hitting the bottom. But again, lily pads and wild rice always grew together. It's just when we humans have tipped the scales of everything ecologically and thrown everything out of balance. Yeah. So the one thing I would say with Phragmites, I always encourage people, I know that there's a lot of work of spraying Phragmites to try to, control it as a non-native species that is running wild. They oftentimes spray during the time that the rice is in seed or right before. And so I always try to encourage people to wait on spraying Phragmites until like the end of September if they can, because that way it'll give the rice plants enough time to drop their seed and reseed for the next year and not harm the rice.
Sure. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Sarah wondered if there's any organizations restoring the rice we can support if we weren't able to plant rice ourselves.
Yeah, that's one of the, I don't know if frustrating is the right word. There's the way you can help protect rice today, right now, is to educate yourself about it, educate yourself about the cultural importance and significance of it, and then teach other people, particularly non-native people I'm speaking about. Many people don't know we have wild rice, and they don't understand why it's important. And so educating people right now, where when there are projects that come up in an area, they will support it and understand why. Contacting your legislators and saying that you support the manomen bill, having it listed as a state grain, will really help us, because that will increase the educational opportunities statewide. Getting people to understand what wild rice is the first step in protecting it. Because it's hard to restore, and because there's not a lot of places that are suitable for it, and because you can't just go take seed from the threatened species and plant it somewhere else, this is all still kind of in the early stages, relatively speaking. There's no organization that I know of that you can just donate money to, for instance, or something like that. So it's not what people want to hear, because everyone wants to help. But I think at this stage of the conservation of this wonderful plant, really educating people is the most important thing. And if you do find rice, to let somebody know about it, the DNR or me, or so that we can keep track of it and try to protect those sites that we have now.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So Margot asked about white capping. You
Mhm.
mentioned it in your newspaper clipping, and she wonders what that was.
Yeah, I wondered what that was too when I first saw it, and I looked it up, and it was a horrible thing. People would, if you were getting white capped, people would burn your barn, burn your farm down. They would kill your animals. They would hang you. I mean, it was the most violent, awful thing that people would do to each other, and so that's what they were threatening to do to farmers
Oh,
who, yeah, I had no idea that occurred, but
wow. Um, Wapato, does that grow
duck
in?
potato, yeah,
It's
duck potato.
WAPATO,
Hmm.
Wapato. Yeah, does that grow in Michigan?
Yes,
It does, okay.
yes.
And then Margot also asked, did the use of drain tiles also figure in the drying up of the land? Drain tiles.
Yes, drain tiles facilitate it. Yeah, like when we do wetland mitigation, they'll often break up drain tiles in an area that was formerly a wetland and had been drained for agriculture. So they break up those tiles, and that stops the water from draining out. But the drain tiles basically take the water from the soil and put it in a ditch.
Mm. Okay, and Jose or host, anyway, asked if there's opportunities for folks to harvest, or are efforts still solidly in the restoration phase?
Harvesting, that's a very good question. Harvesting here, our rice beds have been decimated so much that we only have maybe a handful of places that have enough rice that people could harvest. And right now, it's primarily the tribal people who are doing the harvesting, which I think is appropriate because it's their cultural tradition. You have to learn how to harvest. You have to learn how to process it. Processing of the rice is extremely labor intensive. If you don't have a machine that can do the, I guess you call it threshing, to get the hull off of the grain and to winnow it, to blow the chaff away, you have to do that by dancing on it with moccasins on your feet. And you have to do it all by hand. And it's extraordinarily labor intensive.
Mm.
So people really need to be taught how to how to harvest rice by tribal people and to do it in a good way. It's a gift. It's a gift to us. It's a gift to the people, I think. And it's a wild food. I always promote this with wild foods, that wild foods are not commodities. They're not agricultural crops. There's not a lot of it, right? So it wasn't meant for lots of people to go harvest. I know there's been talk about whether there will ever be harvest regulations in Michigan. I don't know. Certainly, the tribes are working on their own regulations, but we don't have a lot of rice in the big rice beds we have. So it's not. It's just not a lot of rice. That's all I can say.
No, thank you. That's shameful. Jennifer wonders about malaria. Did you know how this affected the native people? Did it have an effect on the native people?
I do not know. I would imagine it probably affected them similarly to us, although perhaps they were out in the water and more susceptible to it because they were out in it more. But mosquitoes are everywhere, right? And I don't know, like, the origin of malaria. I don't know if that's a um, disease that came from somewhere else to here. It might be, but I'm not a public health person, so
Yeah,
yeah, I don't really know for certain.
thank you. Denise wonders, she asks, does NPS help on wild rice restoration on these public lands? And would Deb Holland, HAALAND help
Mhm.
support greater efforts?
Yes, they do. I think they do have a project maybe up at Sleeping Bear Dunes. I know the U.S. Forest Service has projects in the Upper Peninsula. I don't know if how, and there is some in, oh, I'm trying to think which forest it is, where Hamlin Lake is, up in that area. They have been working on restoration there as well. So I don't know if it's, I know she's aware of it because she works with the tribal people here. I don't know if how much more effort. It's a slow process. That's all I can say. If you think about the life cycle of the rice and where will it grow and what do we have left in suitable habitats, it's a slow process.
Thank you. Thank you. Tricia asks if there are any plans to reverse the drains that were created.
No, there's not. Um, the times that they are reversed is when people are doing wetland mitigation or private landowners that want to revert some of their farmland or land that they bought that was drained and they want to turn it back into wetlands. There are people who do that, but in terms of like the general landscape, I can't see that they will ever take those drains away.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Someone also asked if you knew of any online sources for wild rice, and they also wondered, do beavers have a role in wild rice?
Well, the first question, you can go to a website that I maintain. It's called nativewildricecoalition.com. And there's some sources of wild rice that's native harvested that you can get. White Earth sells wild rice. You could look them up. I think their company is called Native Harvest. In Michigan, as I said, we don't have big rice beds anymore like they do in Wisconsin and Minnesota or up in Canada. And so we don't have enough rice beds to support any kind of market in that way. I've had people contact me from all over the country, restaurants. I had someone from China contact me. They wanted to buy 100,000 tons of wild rice. How do they get that from here? And we just don't have it. You would have to buy it from probably Canadian harvested rice or rice from Canada. I shouldn't say Canadian, sorry, or Minnesota or Wisconsin. There's a page. There are links there on that web page that you can get.
Thank you. Yeah. Do you know if wild rice will grow well in fens? You know,
No, I don't think it will.
okay. Well, I think that's about all I can see for most of the questions. The other ones you seem to have answered. Oh, here's a one more question that came in from Mark. Where does the wild rice come from in the food we eat around here?
The wild rice that you buy at the grocery store is almost always paddy rice or agricultural rice that's grown in California, some in Minnesota. But you can always tell the difference between the wild rice and the domesticated wild rice. The paddy rice is what we call it. Domesticated rice is always black. Often it's shiny. It's all the same length. It's generally pretty big grains. It takes about 45 minutes or an hour to cook. True wild rice, true wild rice is different colors, different lengths of grain, sometimes not, extraordinarily different, but it takes about 20 minutes to cook. And they're very distinctive side by side. Anytime you're driving on US 2 and you see a sign, wild rice, That's almost always domesticated wild rice.
Okay,
It's not the true wild.
okay, okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Barb. That
Sure.
was just
Uh,
very
yeah.
interesting.
I appreciate you having me. It's, one of those subjects it's hard not to get too deep into it because there's so much to cover, but I really appreciate everyone's interest and joining us this evening. And thank you so much for having me.
Wow, thank you so much. Um, just want to let everybody know that this is the beginning of some great 2023 programs. Our March program will be also a Zoom presentation. I believe it's on Aldo Leopold, I think. And we have some great field trips coming up with the warmer weather. And don't forget, in July is our native plant sale. We hope you'll make it to that and pick up some more native plants. And you can find more details about all of this on our website. So thanks again, everybody, for being here. Thank you, Barbara Barton, for that wonderful presentation. We'll see you all
You're
later.
welcome.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.